Donald Trump found a way to fix a 35% approval rating. Nothing like cruise missile Viagra. Next on Emil Guillermo's Takeout. Hi, everyone. Hey, and welcome to what I call Emil Guillermo's Takeout. We serve it, you take it out. My takes on all things about race, society, politics, and diversity, and everything those things touch in our culture and society with respect to Asian Americans. And you don't have to be Asian American to lend us your ears. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host. And you might say, Emil, why Amok? Well, the short story is that for nearly 15 years, my Emil Amok column was a staple of Asian Week, what was once the leading Asian American weekly in English in America. Amok was the name of my compilation of essays, and which won the American Book Award. And Amok is on my driver's license, not indicative of my mental state. Hey, you can check us out on the ALDEF blog. That's aaldef.org/blog. It's the blog of the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. And it's a 501c3, so there's a little red podcast or a little red donation rectangle there. Just click on it. It's tax deductible. You know, Donald Trump is all hot about Syria. I mean, sure, what happened in Syria is a disgrace. But you want to talk war crime? I hope Donald Trump mentions the Bataan Death March this weekend. I mean, April 9th marks the 75th anniversary of the horrible war crime that people have heard of but don't really know. And, you know, possibly it's because 10,000 Filipinos died and just 650 Americans. Also on this podcast, I talked to Jenn Fang of the reappropriate.co blog. It's a cool, one of the longest running blogs in Asian America. Jenn loves Ghosts in the Shell, and she tells me it's even worse than we all feared. But first, what a week. Mr. America First, Donald Trump, the man who never met a wall he didn't like. You know, we know he has no compassion for the undocumented. Same for the 24 million he'd gladly lop off Obamacare, or the countless others impacted by his pro-military budget. He's never even been a big proponent for caring for Syrian refugees. But show him pictures of the latest victims of Syria's Bashar al-Assad sarin gas attack in the northern Syrian province of Idlib, and we're to believe that Trump is a different guy? I mean, is this the guy who'd cry at Mike Flynn's going away party? I mean, I dare say, if you buy that, I have a set of Trump University DVDs I'd like to sell you. I mean, here's the thing. I mean, in the video statement on Thursday night from Mar-a-Lago, Trump spoke of the, quote, slow and brutal death for so many, even beautiful babies, were cruelly murdered in this very barbaric attack. I mean, and then he said, he pulled the God card. He said, no child of God should ever suffer such horror. I mean, it was convincing. But remember, this guy's an actor. I mean, touch of humanity, maybe, but I mean, just consider the last few months. So I'm sorry I'm a little skeptical and not buying it hook, line, and sinker. I mean, I just think it's his way of soft-selling nearly 60 Tomahawk cruise missiles into Syria. I mean, Trump didn't even seek congressional approval, though some members of Congress were told beforehand, according to reports. I mean, it may not be needed if it's just a signal to the world that the U.S., despite Trump's inaugural message, was still going to be the moralistic big dog in the world, especially when it comes to the fight against chemical weapons. And Trump did imply that the strikes were a retaliation for Syria's violations under the Chemical Weapons Convention, calling for all civilized nations to join us. So maybe this will be a limited action. But maybe it won't. I mean, Syria is about as complicated as the Middle East gets. I mean, more complicated than healthcare, and we know how complicated healthcare was for the Donald. More complicated than putting together a travel ban, and you know how good travel bans have been with Trump. I mean, one strike may not be good enough in a land where wars last forever. I mean, the good thing is it's easy to rail out against a brutal dictator like Assad. But I have a hard time believing Trump staying up late at night crying for the innocent. Trump basically is an opportunist. And he's a showman. Consider what a few cruise missiles do for a limp presidency. And all this on the night he entertains China President Xi Jinping. I mean, Trump flexes a little muscle for his guest and instituted parties in places like North Korea. Tomahawks, anyone? You can bet message was delivered. This is also the week where his approval ratings have dipped to 35%. Nothing like flashes of humanity and military strikes to goose up the numbers. And with all Trump's problems concerning Russian meddling, a military attack works wonders for all that. Devin who? Now, besides, reports say the U.S. did not consult Syria's enabler, that would be Russia, for approval, that is, prior to the attacks. Now, you notice that at the Rose Garden, Trump did not mention Russia at all. And now CNN reported that Russian ground forces were tipped off to reduce Russian casualties. Maybe that was a courtesy call. So there's enough to suggest to Trump's doubters that he's not 100% beholden to Putin, maybe just 40%. All this week, and the Senate goes nuclear to assure that the next Supreme Court pick is Trump's guy, Neil Gorsuch, by Friday night, which will, of course, be no cause for celebration, considering the humanity that Gorsuch showed in dealing with Grace Wong. You can check out my All-Def blog post on that. And then, of course, this is all coming so late in the week, it's kind of spoiling the joy of seeing Steve Bannon demoted to millionaire toady and hanger-on, as opposed to the man who just in January was seen as de facto president. And the weekend promises even more. What, more strikes? A response from other countries? Maybe it's an opportunity for the Philippines' Duterte. In the same way that Bush got support for his intervention, remember, from the Philippines? I think it was the Philippines and Australia who came to support W on his foray in the Mideast. Maybe this is Duterte's chance to chum up with old Trump. And then there's, China's president still hanging around. Will he be impressed by any of it? I mean, he's no golfer. I mean, will it be a working weekend for both of them? Maybe they'll do takeout. Now, I mentioned how I hope Trump mentions the 75th anniversary of the Bataan Death March. It wasn't just a John Wayne movie, but no one knows about it because it's rarely taught. And it's important for the U.S., but in particular for Filipinos, because this, and I say this as an American Filipino, this was our heroic moment. Daniel Phil Gonzales is an Asian American Studies professor at San Francisco State University. He helped me put together or to put the Bataan Death March into context and to figure out why it's important to remember from the Filipino perspective. The 75th anniversary of the Death March, it's one of those strange, iconic events that people have heard of it, but they don't really know it. I mean, is that a fair summation of the Bataan Death March in popular American culture and American society?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that is very, very true. The problem is that as iconic as it is, the vast majority of people who even know about the Bataan Death March and that it happened, including Filipinos themselves, have a really quite a shallow understanding. Basically, that there was a surrender of troops, both on Bataan and Corregidor. That's U.S. and Filipino troops. And then the surrounding by the Japanese after the surrender, the capture and the forced march, and the imprisonment under extremely cruel circumstances for a substantial portion of the war. And that's basically what people know. They know that many Americans died, and that many Filipinos heroically saved the lives of some Americans by pulling them off the march whenever the opportunity arose. But the other side of the event or circumstances is that many more Filipinos died on that march than Americans.
Well, one of the things about just the name Bataan Death March sounds ominous, and if you only saw it as a paragraph in U.S. history in high school, if you weren't lucky enough to study greater aspects of, say, the Pacific Theater of World War II in college, I mean, it's pretty ominous, the name Bataan Death March. But as you were alluding, there were 75,000 Filipino and American troops that were captured. And I mention it in this podcast because April 9th, 1942 is the 75th anniversary of the march. Tell me about the significance in the war.
It was the equivalent for the Second World War in the Pacific to the Alamo in terms of motivating American fervor to carry on the war. And it was certainly a major motivation for Filipinos in the United States to join in the war effort. And that raised a set of issues all on its own. The fact that Filipinos wanted to join the U.S. military and join the fight in the Pacific.
But they weren't able to.
Because of their curious status as wards and nationals, the technical term for their status. They weren't citizens, they weren't aliens, they were this in-between thing called nationals. And it took the interceding in great part of General Douglas MacArthur and also the activism of local Filipinos, mostly located in California, pressing on Congress to allow Filipinos to join the U.S. Military.
Let's just go over some basic facts. All right, April 9th, 1942 is when the Death March began. That was the surrender of what people call the biggest surrender in U.S. history, and likely the most horrific war crime in the Pacific Theater, when you consider that it was 75,000 Filipino and American troops, like a stadium full. They were all marching from that Bataan Peninsula 60 miles north to a prison camp, Camp O'Donnell, with no food, no water, no medicine. And this is all during the tropical heat in the Philippines. I mean, you've been to the Philippines, and April is not the stickiest month, say, compared to, say, August, but it's still pretty hot with no food, no water.
The rainy season starts in mid-June or so and goes all the way to October. And then there's some dry months. The cooler months are around, December, January, February, March. But then it starts to get really hot and dry. And that was the case in April.
So in terms of humane treatment, I mean, because one of the ideas that I've read in the history books is that the surrender was debated, but they thought that by handing over these prisoners to the Japanese, that they would be treated humanely.
It was a big mistake. The Philippines wasn't prepared. MacArthur had been commissioned to go to the Philippines and prepare for the possibility of a Japanese attack. But he was sorely underfunded, and the military preparedness of the Philippines was next to nothing when he came up with WPO3, War Plan Orange 3, and the fortification of Corregidor was part of that plan. The problem was that the Filipinos who were fighting with the Americans stationed at Corregidor and on Bataan were not well trained. Neither were they well equipped. And so
Right.
it was going to be a terrible battle at best. And they still held out for a long time. They kept getting orders to hold on, and in the hopes that there would be reinforcements. And they held on for months and finally had to surrender for the lack of food supplies, including ammunition.
The other thing I noted is that the Filipinos and the Americans, they had more in terms of, say, sheer, manpower. But as you said, they weren't as well trained. They were ill equipped. They were waiting for these reinforcements to come, and they never came.
That's right.
And so, in a lot of ways, they were fighting under false pretenses. In some regards, I mean, they knew that the shift would come, and it would not be the Pacific, but it would be Europe that would take priority.
Yes. And of course, you wouldn't want to tell them that under those circumstances. Yeah, the thing about the Death March is that, Filipinos were colonized by the United States. Their status was that they were a territorial protectorate of the United States, which is just a nice term to describe colonial status. And one of the things that was really a major marker for the Philippines is that the United States established a free and open public school system from kindergarten all the way up to PhD, with the University of the Philippines, which was established eventually. But the important consideration is that colonial educational effect really tied Filipinos to an image of America, an idealized image of America, and also a subordinate image to Americans. Okay, and so white supremacy was clearly a part of the experience that Filipinos were having under American colonization. And that's not a popular thing to talk about, but what it does is it reinforces the importance of belonging in the mind of many Filipinos, of belonging to the United States, because the United States was clearly expanding its relationship with the rest of the world. It was a growing industrial power. The image of the United States as a democracy, an open democracy, despite the racial segregation as the rule of law, was something that won both the hearts and minds of Filipinos. And so they had a strong desire to be part of America, to be recognized by Americans. And the war actually opened that opportunity for them. In point of fact, there were writers who joined, writers who were living in the United States who were joined the U.S. military, many of them the U.S. Army, and they wrote about the hope for recognition and liberation from racism, the gain of equality with other Americans, which from our point of view today is a rather naive expectation or a naive hope, because they really didn't understand the depth of racism. And despite the fact that many Filipinos were able to live an improved relationship with many white people, particularly their fellow soldiers.
Well, there they were side by side, and let's clarify this too, because a lot of people who think of, they might be Filipino Americans and they have relatives, older relatives who were in World War II, but they were already, many of them were here in the United States already, and they went after Bataan. The people in Bataan were generally those who were members of the U.S. Army Forces in the Far East, the USAFFE, and they answered the call of Roosevelt, right? They answered the call of Roosevelt to serve, and in exchange for their service, they were promised the benefits and pay and all the goodies that come with being military servicemen, right? And this is how we got the Filipino veterans issue that came about after the war, when the Rescission Act essentially cut them out for those benefits.
The reason I exist is because my father fought in the Second World War. That's how he met my mother, and they married, and I was born here. Many of my cousins and my father's closest friends, who were also in the war, had older children that were born in the Philippines and then came here at a young age, in the late 40s and early 50s. But the point about benefits is really important, because one of the promises was that they could elect to become American citizens. And that offer was made to Filipinos who joined the U.S. military. So instead of, and by the way, at that point in time, Filipinos could not be naturalized. There was an issue even before the war about the status of Filipinos, and there were a very active group of Filipinos in the United States that were in contact with the more liberal, progressive, and even radical members of Congress, who were willing to press the rest of Congress for the possibility that Filipinos could become naturalized under the typical 5-year plan, right? A residency, learning a few things about the history and civic functions of American government, and then taking a test for citizenship. And ironically, that push was realized about a year after the end of the war, and just after, in fact, the Rescission Act that you mentioned, which came down in December of 46.
Your father was already here in America when he joined the Army, correct?
Yes. A little bit over 8,000 men joined 2 regiments that were formed here in California and in the Salinas Valley area. And they trained at Hunter Liggett and Camp Roberts down the coast, just north of San Luis Obispo, around that area.
Right. And Salinas Valley, that was one of the early places where the nationals from the Philippines would come to California. They would work in the fields. They'd find their way to these ag communities like in the Salinas Valley. And so it was natural for them to sign up.
One of the major motivations, once again, is that the Japanese were occupying the Philippines, and even though the stories of torture and maiming and sex slavery and all that hadn't reached them, they were concerned about their families back in the Philippines, and they wanted to go back there and liberate the Philippines. The problem was that, like African Americans, their role typically, once they were allowed to join the military, would be in servile functions. So things like quartermaster corps, loading and unloading ammunition, maybe motor pool, and the kind of thing that they did in the Navy, which was work as valets in the service class,
Right.
and
Or work as
same thing
cooks.
would have been true in the Army as well, and the Army Air Corps. But Douglas MacArthur interceded and made it clear that Filipinos were to have full combat status, and so they were able to train as infantrymen, as my father was, and most of his friends.
Was your father in Bataan?
No,
Mm-hmm.
they went to the Philippines later that year, same year,
Mm-hmm.
42, but they went to the Philippines later that year. They actually spent time in either New Guinea or Australia awaiting orders for the invasion of the Philippines.
So the people who were in Bataan were mostly those from the Philippines who joined or who answered Roosevelt's call, joined the
Hmm.
USAFFE, and they were the bulk of, well, they were the Filipinos who were there, the 75,000 who were in Bataan, and we
Yes.
mentioned the unevenness of the casualties. There were something like 10,000 Filipinos who died and just 650 Americans who died.
And that's one of the reasons that the current effort to have this portion of joint history, U.S. and Philippine history, um, included in the textbooks, the history textbooks, at the high school grade levels here in California, because it helps to explain, how Filipinos were here, and it does so in a rather heroic fashion. One of the ways that Filipinos um, identify with the war is that they were self-sacrificing, that they were fighting not only for the freedom of the Philippines, they were fighting for the freedom of the United States, and they were.
Yeah.
And there's a certain amount of obligation that many Filipinos feel the United States has towards them, and that was quite evident in the struggle of the veteranos who were not in American uniforms. There's a lot of confusion, right? Even during the war, um, Filipinos in the U.S. Army would be given directions to Philippine units, not U.S. units. And they also were the victims of racism even during the war, even at the hands of U.S. military officers. And there were a lot of mention of that in after action reports that we've read, particularly retired Major Alex Favros, who's a really strong historian on World War II.
The idea, though, is that a lot of people don't understand that division between the Filipinos who were here in the United States
Hmm.
and who later, after Bataan, went into World War II, and those who were originally from the Philippines, answered Roosevelt's call, fought, got caught in the Bataan Death March, and many of whom survived and then later went back to the Philippines. There are still that group of veterans, because some people say, well, if they fought for America or in the U.S. Army, why didn't they just come to America? Well, some of them chose to stay in the Philippines and
That's
receive
true.
the eventual benefits that were ultimately granted to these veterans in 2009. That's how long it took.
Hmm.
But some of them are
Hmm.
still in the Philippines.
There are very few left at this point. My father passed away in 2005 at the age of 96,
Mm.
and he was in his late 30s during the war. almost too old by law to join the armed forces. Many of his cohort were actually older than 38. They used to call people who got disqualified because of that age rule P38s, which I thought was pretty funny as a kid because the P38 was also a reference to a very cool looking twin fuselage fighter plane. But anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, the the benefits were something that were promised. They were then rejected, and the people who like to take credit for freeing the slaves, the Republican Party, much like today, were the people who are real stingy with money, and with government issues. They were also against the GI Bill, by the way.
Hmm.
And one of the major arguments, this is the GI Bill that gave benefits to all veterans. Okay? Republicans were against the GI Bill because they felt it would be a disincentive for them to work. Instead, they would just take advantage of whatever money was available to GIs in the post-war era. I make a big deal out of this in my classes because the GI Bill was really one of the greatest economic and social equalizers in the history of the United States.
It enabled the Filipinos to buy houses, many of them.
Yeah, well, they got jobs. They qualified for civil service positions, which were guaranteed. I mean, people stayed on the job for a lifetime. Everything from being U.S. postal workers all the way up to getting their college degrees and becoming engineers, electricians. So, it really was a major step up and forward for many people of color, including Filipinos.
I mean, but the whole GI Bill idea, it was like a form of affirmative action in a way.
Absolutely. Runs parallel to the GI Bill. The GI Bill was a form of affirmative action that really spurred the growth of the American middle class.
So now we know that the Bataan Death March was responsible for motivating Filipinos who were in the United States to join the army and to go fight. And it was also a motivating factor for Filipinos who wanted to be like America. They wanted to fight side by side and they wanted to prove their worth. They answered Roosevelt's call.
Yes.
And and yet, like I said, it's still 75 years later. It still feels like, boy, we're still playing catch up. We're still looking for the recognition of how significant this event was.
Well, you know, there's no easy way to say this, okay? But the United States was based on race. The most obvious indication of that is the existence of slavery as an economic, political, and social institution, and the aftermath of slavery as well, which obviously is most suffered directly and indirectly by people of African descent in this society. But what people fail to understand is that until the 1970s, I would say, the early 70s, virtually all people of color were treated as though they were black. So despite the fact that Brown versus Board of Education, many people think that that did away with racial segregation, and it did in one form. But over the intervening 10 years, all the way up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, there was resistance from states all over the United States, not just from southern states, but from Midwestern states, from even some northern states, northeastern states, and even western states, like not California, but other western states as well. Oregon, for example, Nevada, Idaho, and so this concept of a racial and racialized America is something that's still very much with us. And so Filipino veterans, no matter how accurately and we describe their history, and how accurately we describe the Bataan Death March it doesn't have the same meaning for white America that it does for Filipinos.
Well, one thing it did do is also racialize the enemy, the Japanese. I mean, it
Yes,
may have been used to fan the flames of a kind of yellow peril that in the United States.
absolutely. There are stories. The post-war society is filled with stories of Japanese American men in uniform returning to the United States and still suffering um, abject racial insult and threats, even when they were wearing a uniform. One of the classic stories was one told by the now past deceased Senator Daniel Inouye, who was a senator from Hawaii for decades. And he lost an arm during the war. And he told a story about how he was refused service by a barber who dismissed the American uniform and just treated um, Senator Inouye, who was in uniform at the time, um, as as an outsider, as an other, and refused service.
In many ways, the Bataan Death March worked to. It sort of helps explains a lot of things in Asian American history from a Filipino sense, a Filipino American sense, and also a Japanese American sensibility in
Yeah,
terms
well, we
of.
both get otherized. You know, all Asians get otherized in common, and that otherization is unique. It's a unique kind of racism against people of Asian descent. Um, it's in some ways we're seen as being threatening to American culture because of the old stereotype, you know, sneak attack, right?
Mhm.
And that's directly related to Pearl Harbor.
Right.
Uh, Inscrutable, which is a term that was applied to quote Orientals unquote even before the Second World War, and all of those kinds of stereotypical uh, concepts of Asians were visited even against Filipinos even after the war.
Right.
And that's I'm talking about the majority of American society, and not only whites. I mean, it's other people of color as well looked on Asians and even Filipinos in that way. The exception, of course, were people, as you mentioned earlier, who actually fought side by side with Filipinos. So other military people who had gone through the experience of the war with Filipinos had a much more welcoming attitude towards Filipino participation in American society. And I saw that very clearly as I was growing up. People who were at the highest level of white society uh, who had gone through the war were very gracious and actually had gratitude uh, towards Filipinos who they knew had also worn the American uniform. And many of them were rather kind and accepting of Filipinos without regard to the war or whether or not they were engaged in the war, simply because they were familiar with us as people,
Right.
because they had done some time in the Philippines, or they had grown to know Filipinos on a personal level.
Yeah. So all of this from the Bataan Death March, and you know, yet we still have, because until it gets in the history books, and here in California, it might be a paragraph, but it's not much more than that. For some people, the only thing they know about Bataan is the John Wayne movie Back to Bataan,
Right. And
which
and they yeah, there's a
and
couple of movies, and Back to Bataan is one. There's another one,
there's one on
and
Corregidor that's
I'm
interesting.
I'm blanking on the title, but everybody dies. Yeah, but do you remember how the Filipino was depicted in that? They depicted him as a native savage.
Hmm.
You know,
I,
he's back
I,
to being basic. It's really embarrassing. I mean, it is horrible.
well, how about this? In Back to Bataan, first of all, let's historically. the general who ordered the Bataan Death March, Mashaharu Homo, was
Yeah.
convicted of war crimes in April 3rd,
Yes.
1946. But
Hmm.
perhaps the biggest indignity is in the movie Back to Bataan. General Homa, is played by a white man, Leonard Strong,
Yeah, that's right.
and Leonard Strong, who made a career out of playing Asians, a
Orientals.
white man
Yeah,
playing Asians. Yeah,
yeah. They weren't Asians; they were Orientals, man.
they're Orientals. But
It's
that
like
movie
it's
was
like
made in
Emperor
that.
Ming, you know,
Yeah, that movie was made in 1945. I mean, that was like hot off the
after the war. Yeah,
presses,
yeah.
and so uh, and a year before Homa was actually executed and convicted for war crimes.
Hmm.
So, and let me just finish off by just ask you the importance again of 75th anniversary, the importance to learn this history now still.
Today, in this context, right? Once again, Filipinos need to remember that even though we may feel today that we belong, it's points in history like this that made that belonging, as partial as it is, in my opinion, possible. Uh, we are exceptional in many ways, but what we're best known for at this point in time is because we've been contestants and sometimes winning contestants in sing and dance, uh, you know, contests, televised contests. And we prove our talent really well. I think we have reasons to be proud. We've had a few athletic successes, but it's issues like this that show the profound connection of one whole people, the Filipinos in the Philippines, Filipinos in the United States, with this concept of the United States of America. So I don't know. I think we're still a little limited in terms of how we move and where we move in American society, right along with other people of color. Uh, I think that I remember when Immigration Naturalization Service, the former INS, which is now ICE, was doing raids back in the 70s. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And early 80s. And Filipinos were saying, well, all of those people deserve it because they're illegal, they're undocumented, and all the rest of that. And then a few Filipinos who were completely legal, working in Silicon Valley, were also dragged all the way down to the border and shoved across the border into Mexico. And I said, well, how's it feel now? When Proposition uh,
87.
187, yeah, when that came up, a lot of Filipinos voted in favor of that, as though they were going to be distinguishable, you know, uh, people who were legally present and documented versus the undocumented. And I said in my classes, what makes you think that people who want to enforce that law are going to be willing to make the distinction? I mean, that is so naive.
So, in many ways, the Death March is a reminder of the dedication and the loyalty of Filipinos who really fought in a colonial war. I mean,
Yes,
or fought from a colonial position to try to prove their worth.
they were fighting from the position of colonized people. Yes, and their desire to be accepted by America, and particularly white America, was very, very strong. Um, I use articles written by Fernando Tagawa and Doroteo Vite, who were in the military, U.S. Army, and they were very wishful and hopeful about being accepted. I think Fernando Tagawa's title was "Oh, Emancipating War!" exclamation point. And the Bataan Death March is the highest level of sacrifice, of heroism, and that's one of the reasons that Filipinos fight for its recognition in its proper place in the history book.
I mean, because when you see these images of what these guys went through, I mean, they ate nothing. They were withheld food and water. Some of them ended up with malaria, and then once they got to Camp O'Donnell, they stayed there, allowed to starve. And then if they didn't die, they were put in ships and sent to Japan, and some of them were liberated in Japan.
Some died in those ships because they were attacked by U.S. forces and allies,
right,
as enemy ships.
So that's another one of the tremendous tragic ironies. It would be a good thing if everyone knew just a little bit more about it.
It's going to be tough. I like you. I'm really concerned about how the story is going to be told, because the best we're going to get is a couple of paragraphs. And I think that while I'm supporting the movement to get that history into the texts, I'm really concerned about how. I have been from the start. When I first heard about the project, before the enabling legislation was even passed, my focus was always, what is the story? How is the story going to be told? What is the story? How is it going to be told? Who's going to tell it? Whose perspective? And I'm still concerned about that now.
Whose perspective should rule?
Well, it shouldn't be the U.S. perspective at all. It should be from the perspective of Filipinos who experienced it. The primary focus ought to be the Filipino experience in relationship to the United States, because obviously we want to make that connection. It's a tough one to make when, as you put earlier, the people who suffered the march itself were people who joined the USAFE in the Philippines. So it's a little bit different, right, from Filipinos in the U.S. joining the U.S. military. And, once again, I think those people and the other USAFE people, particularly the guerrillas who fought during the war, I just don't think they're given the credit that they deserve. And I think that's part of the motivation as well, to get the Bataan Death March into the books. I just am saddened by the fact that we isolate one event, right? But that's what we're going to be held to. I mean, I made a reference to the Alamo earlier, and that's what people do. They look at the motivation for the war between the Tejanos and the U.S. at the time that they were independent, and Mexico. And people still say that today whenever they want to do something anti-Mexican. Remember the Alamo. I'm surprised that the current president doesn't use it.
Well, you know what they say, that history is written by the winners, and maybe this is why people like to forget Bataan, because it was such a massive surrender. And although it could be used to show the inhumanity and the war crimes, during World War II. I mean, because that's well documented. But in some ways, it seems that the U.S. would rather forget. And so it would be up to the Filipinos, 10,000 of whom died in the Death March. It would be up to them to say, hey, let's take a moment, let's take a page in history and remember these guys. The Death March was more than a John Wayne movie.
Yep, absolutely. When you raise, it's a whole nother discussion, but when you raise the issue of remembering the atrocities along with the suffering and the heroes and the victims, it raises the issue of sex slavery, the so-called comfort women. And recently I was really dismayed by the behavior of Japanese Americans who I thought knew better and who I'd known as political liberal activists over the past several decades, who were against the memorialization of the historical reality of the comfort women. And this is something that's being played down and essentially denied by the Japanese government, and they're quietly funding people who come out and actually attack the women. I've seen this happen to a Chinese woman and a Korean woman, and say that they're liars, that they never had that experience, that the women who engaged in this activity were volunteers, they weren't sex slaves. I mean, it's just really ridiculous position. But when you see some of the things that are being claimed and stated by the current president of the United States, you know, it's not hard to believe that people will take completely ahistorical and afactual positions for whatever political reasons they desire to serve, and that's what we're seeing right now. I'm really happy with the fact that at least we get the opportunity to put this stuff in the history text. It's really, really important.
Well, one last question. It just seems that every time we talk about history, it's an opportunity to learn and, learn a lesson. But it seems if we have forgotten or never learned the history to begin with, or have shunted it away, that we missed a lesson. I mean, what is the lesson that we should have learned that we haven't learned?
I agree with you completely that if you don't make it clear to people that there were specific causes and effects, and that there are lessons beyond just, quote, the horrors of war, unquote, to be learned from experiences like the Bataan Death March. The cruelty that was visited on both the Americans and the Filipinos is not just an aspect of the horrors of war generally. It's a specific aspect of the kind of attitude that the Japanese imperial military had towards other people. And they were very racist. They were extremely racist and treated people like animals, or worse than animals in many instances, in much the same way that the Germans were going about exterminating Jews. So it's beyond just nationalism. It's beyond just the Japanese imperialism. The greater lesson is that this is the kind of thing that human beings do to each other for reasons of profit, for reasons of gain, for reasons of access to resources. This is what we do, and that's the greater lesson.
Daniel Phil Gonzales is professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. The 75th anniversary of the Bataan Death March is April 9th, and on April 8th in San Francisco's Presidio, the Filipino American community will commemorate the event. Now, the head of the Japanese Imperial Army, who was convicted of war crimes for the Bataan Death March, was Masaharu Homa. But in the John Wayne movie, Back to Bataan, he's played by a white guy, Leonard Strong. It's just a coincidental segue to Ghost in the Shell, the new live-action remake of a 1995 manga hit, but its Asian soul is missing, and that's blasphemous, according to Jenn Fang of the Reappropriate.co blog. She talked to me about why you should save the money and self-loathing and watch the old manga instead of seeing the new live action. Jen, I know you said you're going to do the review so people didn't have to see the movie. So here's an interview with you so people don't have to necessarily read your review. So, actually, no, thank you for joining me. So, 2 years in the making, there was a lot of discussion about the whitewashing when Scarlett Johansson was announced 2 years ago. And we'll discuss that. But first, your closeness to the original. I noticed from your review, you said how important the whole thing, the whole series, Ghost in the Shell, was to you. So tell me, for a lot of Asian Americans now in their 30s who are weaned on this, explain to us older folks why this was so important, why this series was so important to you.
Well, I think Ghost in the Shell, the 1995 anime, is formative for many folks, not just Asian Americans, but many folks of my generation who grew up in the 1980s and the 1990s, looking for media that would reflect different people, different aesthetics, different cultures and different communities, but also a different way to do art, to use film to communicate a message. So Ghost in the Shell has this sort of very important position within the animated zeitgeist because it is this revolutionary science fiction anime film. It presents through the use of animation, very complex philosophical ideas. And for many folks who grew up in my generation, Ghost in the Shell, the 1995 anime, was among the first examples of a film that tackled very weighty, very complex, often very adult philosophical themes in a genre that for many of us living in America, we had thought was mainly for kids, namely hand-drawn animation. And that was exactly the experience I had growing up as a child. I had grown up on Disney films and other forms of hand-drawn animation, which not only featured predominantly characters who were white, who didn't look like me and who didn't reflect my experience growing up as a child who was Asian American, but also Disney films were more catered towards the mentality or the morality of younger children. And so things were very simplistic, plots were very easy to follow, and for someone who was sort of coming of age as a teenager when Ghost in the Shell came out in 1995, this was not only a film that reflected who I was racially as an Asian American woman, but also started to reflect my more the sophistication of my own thoughts, my own philosophies, my own theology, my own spirituality. This was a film that sort of challenged me to think a little bit more on those topics.
Yeah, and I get that because around that time, Beauty and the Beast came out in 91, 92, and Disney was on a hot streak. And I was raising kids around that time, and I know what you mean. And I at the same time, I kept calling Ghost in the Shell, Ghost in the Machine. And there is a link. I mean, it's not just the name of a rock album by the Police, but it refers to the Arthur Koestler book from the 70s, which goes back to philosopher Gilbert Ryle, which even goes way back to René Descartes and the mind-body duality. So I get it in terms of the, the deeper, thoughts that we're all combined in this little package, Ghost in the Shell. So I get it. But now when you take the Japanese look and you take that away and you put in Scarlett Johansson, I guess when you heard that was going to happen in this remake, you had to think, oh, this is blasphemy, right?
Right. I mean, if you think about bringing up Disney's Beauty and the Beast as a comparison to Ghost in the Shell, I think is very apt because for an Asian American child and an Asian American girl like myself, before you have something like Ghost in the Shell, a lot of our animated media, if you think about the female protagonists that we had, not only were they not racially similar to us, did they not reflect us, but the princess is someone who, for the most part, especially during that time in Disney filmmaking, the princess was someone who largely existed to be saved. And even though she was the protagonist of her film, she wasn't necessarily the heroine, the kick-ass heroine, let's say at least. Ghost in the Shell was a film that was about a self-confident female protagonist who was sort of unapologetically feminist, unapologetically sure of her own existence and of her own right to evolve and to push her own boundaries. This was a completely different kind of female protagonist than we had seen in the West in these, Disney type animated films. And not only that, but she looked Asian because she was coming from Japan. This is powerful for Asian American girls.
And to boot, she's not even human. She's a cyborg, right? She's created out of technology.
Absolutely. And so this was also, if we remember the 1990s, this is the rise of the internet. And so for many young Asian American youth, this was also resonating with us because we were also finding communities online. For many of us who were growing up in areas where there weren't large populations of Asian Americans or other people of color who didn't feel as if they had large communities around them, the internet was sort of, at that time and still now, a sort of safe haven for people of color to create communities. And this was, in fact, happening to a large extent for the Asian American community in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. The Asian American online community was booming. And so this cyborg theme of Ghost in the Shell, I think, really hooked onto an increasing digitization of the Asian American community at that time, particularly for Asian American youth.
Right. And if you had a Prodigy account or an AOL account or a CompuServe account and went on Usenet, then you know exactly what Jenn is talking about.
Right. And this was also the height of AsianAvenue.com, too.
This was all at the early stages of the internet. It was exciting. 95, Ghost in the Shell comes out. All right. So now we hear about this remake. It's going to have Scarlett Johansson, and it must have been blasphemous, right, when you heard that 2 years ago?
Absolutely. Yeah, 2 years ago when the news first dropped, I was really, really angry. As has sort of been talked about earlier in this segment, Ghost in the Shell is a very crucial piece of anime for me. I've followed the film and I've actually followed the rest of the series, and I've sort of grown with this series as new installments have gone out. So it's very close to me, and I've wanted a live action Hollywood style treatment of Ghost in the Shell, not necessarily coming out of American Hollywood per se, but certainly a live action treatment that could maybe repopularize the series for a new audience, because I think the themes are very interesting. But when I heard that Scarlett Johansson was being cast, it was my first sort of red flag that this film not only probably wasn't going to understand its source material, and it was probably going to lack the sophistication of its anime source material, but I really felt that Johansson in particular didn't match my vision and my understanding of who the main character, Major Motoko Kusanagi, was as a person, because I felt as if by choosing to cast Johansson, you were missing all of the important things that we know from the source material about this character.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate, and we're going to also warn listeners that there may be some spoilers here, but now it's been 2 years, and look, this was the vision of the filmmakers, of Dreamworks, of the director, the English director. Also, it had the approval of the original Ghost in the Shell director, the Japanese director who came out with it in 95. So, you've had 2 years to allow some of your fears to fester. You finally saw it. You wrote your review. What did you think?
Oh, I thought this film was terrible. I thought it was terrible on every possible level. I had prepared myself for a film that had maybe altered the source material for catering to a presumptive white audience. So maybe they whitewashed all the characters, but they left that as sort of an implicit decision. Ghost in the Shell, the 2017 live action remake starring Scarlett Johansson, takes it a step further and becomes overt and deliberate whitewashing, and by making the whitewashing part of the plot of the film. And the way that they do it, and the many other ways that they commit violence against Asian bodies, and specifically Asian female bodies, was truly stomach-churning for me. I think that this was the next level of offensive beyond even what I could have predicted 2 years ago.
So this was kind of whitewashing 2.0, really, for you.
I almost feel whitewashing doesn't go far enough in terms of talking about what's wrong with this film. I almost feel it's too benign a term to describe the problems that are inherent with this film.
What's the most offensive thing that you found?
Well, I believe that the entire film is not only Orientalist, which is itself a problem, but the film hinges around and this is a big spoiler for our listeners, the final scenes of the film tell us that Scarlett Johansson's character, who has been redubbed Major Mira Killian to reflect the fact that Scarlett Johansson is white, she discovers that she's actually a cyborg who has been created out of the dead brain tissue of a Japanese girl named Motoko Kusanagi. And so we learn through the course of the film that the entire birth of this character that we're supposed to celebrate as her coming into her own and discovering her identity, her birth emerges out of the murder and mutilation of an Asian woman. And in fact, she's not the only Asian woman that is killed in this film in order to service the evolution of Major Mira Killian. But there's also the only Asian female actress not the only, but one of the most notable Asian actresses cast in the film was Rila Fukushima. And she was cast only as a face model for a geisha robot who is shot in the first scene of the film. And her corpse as a robot is featured throughout the rest of the film. So you actually have two examples of dead Asian women being used as objects to advance the plot of this movie, one of whom is actually being worn, essentially, by Major Mira Killian, and her death is being used to advance the Major's identity and her character evolution.
So not only is it sexist or racist, but it's also sexist to boot.
It basically implicitly celebrates a sort of violence against the Asian female body. And this is alongside a film that casually uses Asian male and female, but mostly male extras as gangster characters that are quickly killed off by the Major early in the film as well. So you're seeing a lot of essentially dead Asian people as a backdrop against which this story that features predominantly white protagonists is being played out.
Now, I understand also that based on what you said and also what other people have said, it's the Major is an Asian brain that was given or placed in a white body.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah. That's basically the plot twist. Yeah.
And so this movie in '95, which you saw as affirming in your Asianness, comes back in 2017 saying, you Asians, you have transformed into white.
Right. It's if you go back if you watch the film and then you go back and rewatch it sort of with the meta text of knowing what happens at the end of the film basically starts with the killing and the mutilation and the erasure of this character, Motoko Kusanagi. She is kidnapped, she's killed, her brain is taken, so some part of her may still be alive, but then all of her memories are erased. So this character of Motoko, who is never really seen, you never see her face, you never really hear her voice, she's almost totally erased from the film while in order to enable Major Mira Killian to be born. And so this is taking a film, as you said, the 1995 anime was about Major Motoko Kusanagi being this very strong in herself, very self-confident Asian woman who is her drive to push past her own limits, to see no boundaries for herself, to grow and evolve. This very feminist message. This movie not only fails to translate that particular feminist message, but starts and ends with the inception of this movie is about the total erasure of a woman named Motoko Kusanagi in order to create and evolve this white woman, Mira Killian.
Right. She evolves into whiteness, and it says something about whiteness. But, this is a DreamWorks project, but the original story is really Japanese. And historically, we know that the Japanese have a funny relationship with whiteness, and how people have called it a self-loathing that the Japanese have, and a reverence for whiteness. And in some ways, that is a major chasm between Asians and Asian Americans, right?
And that certainly might be. I mean, we can talk about beauty aesthetics and internalized white supremacy in many Asian cultures, including Japanese culture, with a sort of preoccupation with, let's say, blonde hair, blue eyes, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But I think at the same time, the problem with this film, so there could be a discussion, even within the 2017 film, there could have been a discussion about the film's message of white supremacy, where you're taking a person who is Japanese, actually two people who are Japanese, because we should, as a caveat, also say that the same storyline is there for Hideo, or Kuze's character Hideo. So you actually have two whitewashed characters. But in the story of the 2017 film, where both Kuze and Mira Killian were Japanese people who take on this shell of whiteness and who affirm their identity as white folk, there's no conversation within the film about this transracialization. There's no tension. There's no racial trauma. They don't talk about themselves as having been transracialized and whether or not that's been a violation of the people they were as Japanese teenagers named Motoko Kusanagi and Hideo. And so there was a possibility where they could have talked about this and have it relevant to how Western beauty ideals maybe impact Japanese culture. But they choose instead to completely ignore all of the troublesome racial questions that are raised by this plot twist.
Now, how about Scarlett Johansson's comments saying that, this is not about race. It's kind of identityless. We're in some future world where there is no race. Do you buy that?
Well, so I don't buy that because I'm so familiar with the Ghost in the Shell universe, the animated universe. In the animated universe, looking back as far as 1995, but also later installments into this animated universe, you get the understanding that race and ethnicity are very important to the future Japan that the Ghost in the Shell world is set. Even though these are cyborgs who are able to interchange their bodies, this is a culture that hasn't moved past race and ethnicity. There's still ethnic tensions that arise between Japanese citizens and non-Japanese ethnic minorities and refugees who have been ghettoized by the apparently difficult immigration laws of this futuristic Japan. There are characters who are racialized upon first meeting other characters. I would argue that Motoko Kusanagi is very much part of her character is her self-confidence in herself as a cyberized Japanese woman. Now, whether or not the 2017 film reimagines a future that has no race, one might argue that they're trying to create a different world. But even within the world of the 2017 film, you have hints that race is a factor in this world. So, for example, this is a movie that is set in presumably a future Japan. And indeed, there are people of color in this movie. But it's interesting that all of the East Asian people that we see in this film, all of the people who would be considered Japanese, they're all not only backdrop characters, but most of the time they're presented as sort of lower income people who are sitting on the street seeming not to have any income, not to have any access to the cutting edge technology that the major has. And in fact, in all of this sort of high ranking, wealthy seeming people who are working at Honka Robotics, the company that makes the major, there seem to be no Asian people who are working there. So one wonders what happened to all of the racially Japanese people in this future Japan. And so I would argue that this is... Yeah. I'm sorry, I would argue that this is a future Japan where race and ethnicity clearly had some import and there's some unspoken history that they don't talk about in the film.
In some ways, this is a Hollywood vision, and they don't really care about it would seem to me that they don't care about the social message and that aspect in the movie, but maybe just the commercial one. So cast Scarlett Johansson, put butts in the seats, better than Maggie Q? Is that kind of the way anyone can justify this if they were, say, a member of Dreamworks or Paramount, in terms of, because I understand that they try to justify the casting in the film by saying, hey, there's she's identityless. She is. She's the major.
Well, I think that might have been the conversation that they had, but I don't think it was a logical one, even from the perspective of someone who's trying to sell a film. So there's a couple of things we can say. First of all, there have been a lot of action series or thrillers that have been helmed by relatively unknown stars. The Hunger Games tapped Jennifer Lawrence to play the title role of Katniss before she had any kind of a career, and that series did great. So it's not as if it's a prerequisite to have someone with massive star power sell a science fiction futuristic thriller. On the other hand, I think that they were thinking that Ghost in the Shell might be sort of a difficult concept for moviegoers, and they were thinking maybe they could use this as a way to advance Scarlett Johansson's career. And yet clearly, this is a mistaken calculus for the film producers, because they didn't seem to be able to predict that the whitewashing controversy would have a negative impact on this film. Ghost in the Shell, in terms of its box office returns, has done abysmally, and indeed most of the recent anime remakes from American Hollywood that have engaged in some form of whitewashing have suffered at the box offices as a result, because I think moviegoers are smarter than film producers give us credit.
Well, it opened at, say, 19 million, which was really disappointing for a movie of this that had high hopes. But I guess early on they should have tempered those hopes when they saw the reaction to the announcement of the casting. But you know, Jenn, I've been writing about this for an awful long time, about whitewashing and about Asians being, played by white people. I was just doing something on the movie Back to Bataan, which has John Wayne, made in 1945. And, of course, the General Homa, is played by a white guy. You know, he's the guy who actually said, yeah, we're going to march these Americans and Filipinos, through, from Bataan back up to the Philippines to a prison camp. And the villain was played by a white guy. So, and even before then, of course, with the Charlie Chan movies, you're a younger Asian American woman. This has to be a jarring experience for you to see your such an important film in your childhood or in your adolescence be kind of destroyed by this image.
Yeah.
Where are we now in the evolution of whitewashing, do you think?
Well, so I think I'm really glad you brought up Back to Bataan, because I think it's interesting because that movie specifically was used to justify Scarlett Johansson's casting in Ghost in the Shell. And that was done by Mamoru Oshii, who was the original director of Ghost in the Shell in 1995. He, for whatever reason, gave an interview where he argued that Johansson's casting was acceptable. And his reasoning was that American Hollywood had a long history of whitewashing Asian characters. And he specifically cited that film. And I think in that context, Oshii is right. Like, American Hollywood's been doing this for a very long time. But where I think that logic is flawed is that just because there's been a history of doing this does not mean that this is the right thing to do, that this is either the moral thing to do or something that will work, particularly in the 21st century. I think what has changed about this in Hollywood is that I think that there's a growing recognition that American Hollywood can't get away with this anymore. Maybe 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, there was a sort of casual acceptance of whitewashing. And while the Asian and Asian American community might have an outcry against this, Hollywood was largely apathetic to those concerns. But I think today, whether it's a combination of the rise in the Asian American political movement, or whether or not it's a simple recognition that Asian Americans are a coveted consumer base and that we are very much some of the most frequent moviegoers of America, or whether or not it's a greater recognition of identity politics in general, I think what we're seeing in the last couple of years is growing, if begrudging, acknowledgement that what used to fly 60 years ago probably doesn't fly anymore.
Well, it's about time, right? I mean, and we're starting to see some breakthroughs, certainly Fresh Off the Boat, Dr. Ken. There are others in TV and some in movies. We saw Asian characters in the Star Wars prequel. But, we also saw recently we saw the reemergence of Miss Saigon on Broadway with an Asian cast. And back when that controversy first broke, I remember writing about this on NPR about how dreadful it was to not have to have Jonathan Pryce play the Eurasian engineer, and that was such a big controversy. So every time I think we've gone forward, we have something like Ghost in the Shell to remind us, my goodness, we haven't gone as far as we think.
Yeah, and I think that that's a very astute observation. I think that this is a long process, but mostly where I've ended up now in my 30s, so this is 20 years since I first saw Ghost in the Shell, is that while I would like to see more Asian Americans cast in roles, particularly to play Asian or Asian American characters, I think that the solution for this, for our community, is to see or to look outside of mainstream Hollywood, or at least to look past the casting stage, and to start to support film projects that are Asian American from the ground up, that are starting to tell our stories, maybe through mainstream production houses, but maybe also through independent houses. So Fresh Off the Boat is a great example of, like Master of None, a TV show that is sort of Asian American from its conception. And not only are we seeing Asian Americans before the camera or in front of the camera, but these are projects where there are Asian Americans behind the camera. And I think it's the Asian Americans behind the camera that we really need in order to drive more and better Asian American representation in front of the camera. And so I'm thinking about, like, as we are sort of in this sort of watershed moment where there are more Asian American stars being made, I think this what we'll truly see is that these stars will sort of advance in their career and start to become producers, like Steve Yeun, who is from The Walking Dead, who's using his fame from that TV series to start to take producer credit and to advance projects that tell Asian and Asian American stories, such as an upcoming story that he's working on. I think he has production credit on it, about North Korea. And I think that's what we really need is the people who are in front of the camera now getting to the point where they have enough influence in Hollywood that they can start to back great Asian and Asian American projects.
Right. And there was this Asian, or rather Korean American director who did the film on the spas in L.A. He won a Spirit Award this last time out. It's happening, and it's happening with a new generation. I think many people like yourself who were weaned on Ghost in the Shell, ironically. So maybe there's hope. While I have you, let me ask you just one other question about Ghost in the Shell. If it was made with an Asian star, like a Maggie Q, would it have made a difference?
I think it would have made a difference. I think that an Asian or Asian American star, I actually think Rila Fukushima would have been fantastic in that role, and she was in the film, just clearly cast in the wrong role. If you remember, she was basically she's starting to build a career in American Hollywood, and it is strange to me that she did not get that leading role. But I think that if they had cast an Asian or Asian American actor in that role, I think it would have gone a long way to assuage the whitewashing concerns. Now, if it had otherwise been exactly the same, I think that there still would have been problems, because as I said earlier in this segment, the whitewashing critique, I think, was the appropriate critique to have before we had access to the film. Now that we've had access to the film, there are larger concerns with the film that are not limited to just whitewashing. We also have to really talk about how the film is Orientalist and how it uses a story about violence against Asians to drive the plot forward. Those are things that I don't think would have been fully mitigated had the race of the female protagonist been different.
But when you say Orientalist, you mean what? Stereotypical, or what do you mean by that?
I mean that it was a film that created this theater of Asia that was sort of this exotic and fantastical Asian aesthetic in order to add a level of exoticism and mysticism to the film. It's this sort of fascination with this imagined Asia. And so everything is sort of just a little bit too bright. Things are just a little bit not quite Asian, but it's sort of the Western imagination of what Asia looks like. And one of the best examples of that is what the geisha bot looks like.
Yeah, so this is kind of like the good side of xenophobia.
I wouldn't say the good side of xenophobia. I would say it's the dehumanizing side of xenophobia against Asians, because so Orientalism is sort of this jargony concept, and what it basically argues is that when the West tries to depict Asia, they usually try to depict some caricature of Asia, whether it's the iconography they use, the colors they use, the fashion styling they use. It's not really Asia. It's sort of like this hyper-saturated version of Asia. And when they do that, they create theater. And when they're creating theater, they sort of bring down the level to which you can add humanity to the Asian people who populate that backdrop.
Once again, Jenn Fang encouraging you all not to see the new remake, Ghost in the Shell, but see the 95 classic. And go out and make your own Asian American indie movie. And that's our program. Hey, we're on iTunes. Please subscribe, rate, and review. We're also on most places where you get your podcasts, SoundCloud, YouTube, Podbean, Stitcher. Hey, you can contact me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or go to the ALDEF blog. It's at www.aldef.org/blog. Give us your feedback. And if you like us, consider donating. ALDEF is a full 501c3. Donate. It's tax deductible. Hey, you can even leave a voicemail at 888-580-6069. That's it for episode 8. Thanks again for listening to Emil Amok's Takeout. I'm Emil Guillermo.